It's going to be a little bit of a visual morning here. I'm a visual learner, so I thought we'd put a little PowerPoint together and do our teaching this way, just so it's a little bit different. It's summertime, we're in the summer mindset. And like I said, I'm a visual learner, so I like doing it this way. So it'll be a little bit lighter, but a bit of a teaching around vineyards and around gardens and around the soil of our lives. That's kind of what we put into the notes this morning when we sent out the announcements. And it's going to be like a two-part series. So when I teach in August, it's going to be like part 2 of this. So part 1 is going to be about the vineyards and the gardener and the soil. And then part 2 in August is going to be about the grapes and the fruit and the vine. Okay, so just so you know where we're going with this, and kind of gives you a bit of a backdrop for it. Okay, so just to start off, as a disclaimer, I am not a wine expert. I am not a horticulturist or a viticulturalist or whatever you call it. I am like far from it. So lest I offend anybody that is, don't throw any really hard questions at me or anything like that about wines and grapes and all that, because I'm really far from being an expert in it. But I have learned a lot in the past little while. Traveled a little bit, been to some vineyards, and I'll show you some of those today. And also done some Bible study on it. And so I wanted to kind of bring in some of the Bible study pieces that I've done on my own through a Beth Moore Bible study called Chasing Vines, which was a really great one. So some of this material is coming from that, and then some of this material is just coming from myself and my own study. So in all honesty, grapes are not my favorite fruit. I'm a strawberry person, I'm a cherry person. Not so much grapes. I like them, but they're not at the top of my list. But like I said, I've learned to appreciate so much about what I've learned. And there's this really rich metaphor that's used throughout the Bible about the grapes and the vines. So that's why we're going with this today. I'm going to just put this in present mode. So it's a little bit bigger. Can you guys see it good? Yep. Okay, good. So a little bit about where I've seen some vineyards, and maybe you guys have seen even more vineyards. You've maybe traveled more than I have, but let's just take a few pictures here and look at a few places that I've seen, as well as try to transport us a little bit into our minds. And since we can't travel right now during COVID, let's just imagine that we can travel and go outside of our little homes and boxes right now. So this is a place in the Azores, which is called Tessera. It's an island out in Tessera. I was there a couple of years ago with Rachel, and we just took a quick little holiday, like actually right before COVID hit. So like we got back a couple of weeks right before everything closed down. So we just made it back in time. But the vineyards there are known for their white wines, and it's a volcanic island, so it gives it a different flavor. It gives it a real, I think the volcanic ones have more calcium in the rock. And again, I'm not going to go into all the detail of that because I don't understand it, but it brings out a different flavor. So it's really well known for its white wines. So that's the Azores and Tessera. The other thing about it is you see like a patchwork kind of a thing in the way that they've planted it. And the reason that they do that is because of the volcanic rock that's there. They need to move the rocks out of the way, and they build like little walls. And I know Rachel will remember it too, like you could stand up on like a higher point of view perspective and look down, and it just looks like this beautiful patchwork. And that's what they actually call it, as a patchwork. So the rocks are built into these little walls purposefully so that there's good drainage, and also so that the animals can't get in, because everything roams free there. Like it's not farms with whatever you call it, gates and fences. They don't have that. Everything kind of roams free and natural. So they put these little walls up so that it protects the vineyards from the animals getting in, but then it also helps with the drainage because it's built on the hill, so things don't fall down too much. So that's really interesting. I found that one very interesting. This is in Tuscany, Italy, which maybe some of you have been there too. And again, there you see the rolling hills, and we'll talk about the hills in a little bit. This one is in Jerusalem. And again, you see the patchwork a little bit with the walls. This is an old Jerusalem picture. And I believe it would be for the same reason, to keep the animals out and to help with the drainage to get rid of the big rocks. But it's not volcanic, it's more limestone. And so again, the limestone brings out another flavor in the wines, and it brings out more of the, is it the calcium or the, I don't know what it is in the limestone, but something in the limestone there. And then this one is in the California Napa Valley. And again, you see the rolling hills. Not always do you see rolling hills, but often they will plant vineyards on hills. And we'll talk about that afterwards when we get into the Bible study a little bit more as to why they're planted on the hills. But in Niagara region, it's a lot more flat. That's just where we are in Ontario. But then they've got to irrigate it more, because grapes don't like wet soil. They like to have the drainage. So I believe in the Niagara region, maybe other people know it better, but they're going to have to do a little bit more work around the irrigation piece so that it drains better. That's just a little bit of background for all of this. So there's 10,000 varieties, maybe plus more, of grapes, which I never knew that. I know the red grape, I know the black grape for various wines, and I know the green grape. I didn't know that there was like 10,000 varieties of grapes. There's a lot of different kinds of grapes. And the grape is also like super versatile. So if you think of everything that you can do with a grape, and again, we're not going to talk a lot about the actual fruit itself today. We'll save that for August. But just to give you, again, a little bit of a rounded out view, what the grape is used for, it's so versatile. So you look at the seeds being pressed into grapeseed oil. You look at it being cooked and stuffed with nuts and onions and spices, which is a Greek dish, which is called dolomathika or something like this, whatever it's called. You see those over in the Middle East. And actually my neighbor next door, she's got this grapevine growing through our fence, and she's from the Middle East, and she comes out every once in a while and starts picking the leaves from our side. And I asked her once what she did with the leaves, because I didn't see any of the grapes growing yet. She's like, oh, I cook it and I do this and I stuff it and I do all this stuff. I'll make it for you one day and I'll bring it over. So I'm waiting for it to come, because I'd love to taste that. Fruit can be eaten ripe. We all eat grapes, so you know what I'm talking about there. The fruit can be made into jams and into sauces. One of my memories from childhood, from when I was very little, is going to my grandmother's house in Michigan. And she was from West Virginia, and she would always have Welch's grape jelly on her table at breakfast time. And I always remember Welch's grape jelly. We never bought it ourselves at home, but my grandmother always had it. We used to call her Nanny. But Nanny was also an Italian background. So she always had these black olives on the table as well, these wrinkly dried black olives, which is an Italian thing. So you'd mix the Italian with the American Welch's grape jelly. And that's a memory that I have from when I was a little girl. Grapes can also be dried and made into raisins, which I know my family do not like raisins. We don't put them in anything here. They can be baked into cakes. They can be pressed into juices for drink. They can be fermented into vinegars, and they can be aged into wines. And I'm sure that there's many other things too that I don't even have listed here. So it's no wonder that grapes and vines are mentioned in the Bible at least 58 times. You see the image or the metaphor starting right back in the Garden of Eden, and you see it carry all the way through, and God uses it throughout and speaks about it throughout, all the way through right to Revelations. So you see this picture and this metaphor being brought out like so many times that it's got to be important. But I think more than just being even important, it was something that was relatable. So because that's what they were an agrarian culture, which was a farming culture. And so everybody grew vineyards and everybody grew grapes and everybody planted and farmed. So they could totally relate to the metaphor, which is why I believe that God used it so many times throughout, because he wanted it to be relatable to us. And that is why we're going to look at it today, because it's relatable to us today too. So it is a beautiful image and a beautiful metaphor. But again, let's remember that it's a metaphor. So not everything works out perfect in a metaphor. It's an image. And if you carry an image or a metaphor too far, sometimes it breaks down. You might see that when we talk a little bit more about the vine and the grapes in August. But for today, we'll talk more about the gardener, and we'll talk about the land, and we'll talk about the soil. Okay, so here's our verses that we're going to be drawing our material from. The gardener is mentioned, again, it's said throughout, but the one we're going to look at is John 15:1. We're not going to go past that because I know the whole passage talks about the Jesus being the vine and we're the branches, and we will get into that later. But for today, we're just going to look at the first part of John 15:1, and we're going to look at the first part of Isaiah 5, verses 1, and just the first part of 2a. We're not going to go further than that today. So let's take a read of it. The first one is, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. And then the one in Isaiah says, my beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and he cleared it of stones, and he planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. He looked for it to yield grapes. Okay, let's take a look at the gardener. So let's have a little bit of interaction, so it'll calm my nerves a little bit if you guys interact with me. What does a gardener do? Just throw some things at me. We're a small enough group.
He works the land, or they work the land.
And, awesome.
Yeah.
Yep, he works the land. What else does a gardener do?
Prepares the soil.
Yeah, prepares the soil. Awesome. Anything else?
Fair amount of weeding.
Yeah, lots of weeds have to be.
Weeding, pruning.
Pruning, weeding, yeah.
I guess sometimes they set up a fence to protect it from other animals.
That's great. Yeah. Protects it from other animals and things, for sure. Anything else?
A gardener is not scared to get messy and dirty.
Love it. Is that Kevin? Yeah, I love it. Not afraid to get messy and dirty.
Gardener has a relationship with what he's growing too.
Yeah. Hi, Leslie.
Hi.
For sure, they have a relationship with their fruit.
And I'm not a gardener, but I'm learning this.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah, on what Leslie said, it like celebrates the growth and then gets disappointed or emotional if something doesn't take, right? Like they have this emotional connection to what's happening almost on a daily basis.
Exactly.
For sure. Okay, let me just recap a few then. So a gardener is intentional, and they plan and they plant things where they plan them to be for the best light, for the best drainage, for the flavor that they want. A gardener's not afraid to get their hands dirty. That was mentioned. A gardener will till and take out the rocks or the weeds. I didn't mention the weeds, but that was mentioned. Tim mentioned that. They leave some intentionally for drainage sometimes though, right? Because that makes better soils if the rocks are in there a little bit. They fertilize the soil with nutrients, make sure that it's healthy and full of good nutrients to grow. And they tend to, or they prune it and they take care of it and they nurture it. So there's lots of things that the gardener does. Just from real life a little bit, I'm going to show you Rachel's COVID garden in our backyard. We've got 3 of these huge beds in our backyard. One's against the wall, it's not as big. And then 2 of these that are, what do you call them? Above ground beds or raised beds, I guess you call them, that Rachel's planted in our backyard during this COVID time. She's also got like tons of little pots around that we planted strawberries in and potatoes in. So like you, Leslie, I'm learning a lot, and Rachel has been teaching me a lot. So we've got potatoes planted back there. We've got corn planted back there. We've got beets and radishes and peppers and tomatoes, lots of things that I never even knew we could grow in our backyard. So we've got all of these things growing. And Rachel planned it. back in the wintertime, she was already planning this stuff. She was reading up on it on the internet. She figured out how to make a lasagna raised bed. So I don't know if you know what that is, but you put layers down. So she's got cardboard on the bottom, and then she's got compost and straw, and I don't know what else she's got in there, but she's layered it all up, and she studied on how to make this best little 6-inch to 1-foot garden bed out there in a raised bed. And you see her out there tending to it, and she's literally out there every day. I know she's downstairs listening, so I'm embarrassing her right now, but she's literally down there every day. And she has done the same, like Matt was saying, you've got to protect it as well from the animals. And we've had many squirrels and raccoons come in there and poop, and squirrels come in there and try to eat the corn. So you can see, I don't know if you can see in the picture, but she's got, what do you call it, chicken wire all wrapped around the corn, because the squirrels tried to get in there and eat it, and they were tearing it all down. And literally every day we have to go out there and figure out something new to protect these plants out there. So I've learned a lot, but I've also learned that watching her, she delights in this process. There's this whole, we talked about the relational part of it, and that the process itself is just as satisfying as the end result is. And our end result might be eating the fresh tomato, or eating the fresh beans, or the fresh green peppers, or whatever. But the process itself is just as satisfying, and she's enjoying it so much, and I love watching her delight in it. And I see the same as we look at our relationship with God and him as the gardener. And we see, why would God want to be the gardener with us? And I think it's for those same reasons. It's because he does take pleasure in us, and he delights in the process. He didn't just create it and say, okay, here you go, you're fully grown and here's all your fruit and everything else. But he started it just with planting the garden, even in the garden right back in Genesis, and just allowing us to tend to it and to prune to it and feed it. And it says he sings over it, has this relationship with us and with the fruit of the garden that he's growing. This relational piece is so God intended. And I know that our relationship with God is something that he wants, and it's something that he doesn't just have the end result, but that whole process and that whole piece of just growing in him, even from starting from a seedling and starting those seedlings growing in our dining room over the winter, and then going out to plant them. There's that relationship that's so God intended, and that's what he wants with us as well. So my Father is the gardener. And just a thought to pause here and say, are we letting him be the gardener in our lives? And are we letting him be intentional as to where he wants us? And are we letting him tend to us when we need to be tended to? Are we letting him give us all the nutrients we need to grow and to prune us and to sing over us? So just think about that for a second before we go to the next part. Okay. The next part we're going to look at is the soil, and is the land. And terroir is the word that's used often in gardening. Terroir is the land, and I say it's not a dirty word. Dirt is not a dirty word, no matter what's in it, because we all know what's in dirt sometimes, right? Like there's manure, there's crop, there's all this stuff that goes in dirt, but it's not a dirty word, because within all of that is actual nutrients, and is actually the things we need to grow. And I've got this picture here of the calcium and the magnesium and the potassium and all of the stuff that is in the nutrients of soil. I know when Rachel planted her soil, she's got this chicken manure out there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that just absolutely stinks. But it is what helps to make the garden grow. And you've got the miracle grow, or whatever you want to call it, that you're feeding it with. And if you are a good gardener, you're out there doing that either weekly or bi-weekly to help put those nutrients into those beds and to help it grow. And it says, my beloved has a vineyard, and it's on a very fertile hill. So he makes it fertile, and God is not afraid of getting his hands dirty in our lives. He's not afraid of putting that manure if we need it in there. He's not afraid of putting those specific nutrients when we're missing them and tending to it in that way to make it fertile for us. When we talk about wines, and again, I'm not a wine connoisseur, but there's 14 different types of wine soil, and maybe more than that. And I can't even read it on all of these things, but we talked a little bit about the volcanic wines. We've talked about the limestone wines. Then there's other wines. I know that there's wines in France where they do all of the little rocks, and I'll show you some pictures of that afterwards. And there's a purpose in those rocks that we're going to get to in a little bit. But all of those different types of soils and lands are deliberately chosen to bring the flavor out in the wine and to bring out the different types of wine and the different character in the wines, which I find really fascinating. So what's the soil in our lives? And what do we need to let God do to add to it to make it more fertile? Do we need some nutrients in there? Do we need some manure in there? Do we need it aerated? Do we need some water in there? I just want you to pause and think about that for a second. I think my beloved has a vineyard and it's on a very fertile hill. Okay, you ready to move on? We're gonna have time to discuss later, so that's why I'm not discussing now. But. Okay, the terroir again. Another piece about terroir is the place. It's not just the land and the soil, but it's also the place. And I believe we all have this base setting that we long for home. There's something in us that we just want a place to belong, and we want a place to call home. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that classic movie called Gone with the Wind with Clark Gable, and I don't know who the female actress is, but Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. She's this manipulative, selfish woman all the way through it. But her whole life, all she longs for is to get back to Tara. And her whole life is just to get back to her homeland. When she finally gets that there at the end, I just remember the scene where she just picks up the dirt with her hand and she's just letting it flow through. And she's just like, I'm home. This is home. This is where I've always belonged. This is home. And I don't know if it's the longest movie I've ever watched in my life. I watched it when I was younger, but Gone with the Wind, the whole piece about Tara and that land and meaning to belong somewhere. And you see it all through scripture too. You see where God's always promised them the promised land. And there's this thing about a homeland. There's this thing about place and belonging. And they left Egypt to get to a land of their own. And that homeland was what they longed for. We even see it now in that this so relatable, did the land acknowledgement with Indigenous people. There's something rich with meaning about the land and the home where they belong. So my beloved had a vineyard and it's on a very fertile hill, and it was deliberately planted to be a place called home, right where God wanted it to be. Where are we planted? Just to bring it to us a little bit. Where are we planted? And again, you can't take the image too far or else it's going to fall apart. Can't take the metaphor too far, it'll fall apart. But in the gardener choosing the land deliberately and intentionally, what kind of land has he planted us on? What kind of flavor is he wanting out of our lives? What kind of soil do we have? Is it on a hilly piece? Is it on a volcanic? Is it hot? Is it dry? Is it cool? Where's he placed us relationally? Where's he placed us in our families, in our cities, in our countries? It can be seen as a physical home, but it can also be seen as a spiritual home too, right? And where the scope of our lives is. What's the home that he's planted us in? Or are you feeling like you don't have a home? Are you feeling like you're displaced and you're really struggling with that? Because that's reality too. And a lot of us feel like, I don't really have a place to call home right now. We'll get into that a little bit more in the next time as well. But home is a base setting, and we may always be longing for home. Sometimes we're being transplanted as well. Sometimes it's time to go and it's time to move on. And sometimes God will transplant us from one place to another place when it's time. And we need to know, where are we and where's God planted us? Okay, let's take another look at one more piece here, the rocks that are there. He dug it and he cleared it of its stones. So the gardener preps the land and he clears it of his stones. I think from the pictures that I've seen in some of the vineyards that I visited, it's more the big stones that he moves. It's not the little tiny stony things, because I'll show you a couple pictures of some of these really nice vineyards in France. I think it means the large stones. And like we saw those pictures, he moves those large stones to create the walls to protect it from the animals coming in, to give it good drainage and to allow things so that they don't fall down, and to just put a protection around like walls. The small stones, though, are actually good for the grape growth. And from studying, what I found out is that if grapes don't have stony soil or like gravel soil, they actually don't do very well. They're not like other crops. Other crops might need like really, lush, dark soil, whereas grapes actually need the stones to make their roots work hard. Because if their roots don't actually work hard to go down deep, they only produce leaves. So if they're comfortable and they're not having to work hard, they actually don't build resilience. And without building that resilience, they just produce leaves and they don't produce the fruit and the grapes. They're called, they're asexual. I don't know what it's called. They produce themselves. They don't need something to come in and pollinate them. So they actually produce themselves. So it's just them. And if there's too much ease and comfort, they just do leaves and they don't do the grapes. So those stones and that gravel actually helps. And so purposefully, the gardener puts the little ones in there, or keeps the little ones in there, but takes the big ones out. So I found that fascinating and interesting too. So we say not maybe all the rocks, but maybe just the big ones. And here's that picture of Terceira again, and that volcanic island. And you see how they've moved the big ones, but actually the little ones are still in there. And they told us about that when we were over there. They were explaining that to us. So the place in France, you see the smaller pictures, the place in France is actually called Chateau du Cros Bucoyu. I'm not sure I'm saying that all right, but it's called Beautiful Pebbles. And that produces these beautiful wines and these luscious wines. And you see the vineyard there over in France with the rocky soil. So what are our rocks? And are there big ones that actually need to be moved? Are there certain ones that might need to go just for our health and our growth? I know there's, people deal with different things, right? Everyone's got their own rocks to deal with in their lives, whether it's unhealthy relationships that really do need to go, addictions in our lives, whatever it is that can be moved and need to be moved, and God can move those. But what are the things then that are the smaller things that maybe God leaves there purposely and deliberately, and the things that can actually help us be more resilient and be stronger, because our roots have to grow around them to produce more fruit? And those might be the things that we can't control. Those might be the things that God's left there that we actually can't change. And maybe that is something physical. Maybe that's our mental health. Maybe that's our personalities. Might be our family, things we can't actually change and get rid of. It might be our past. Can't change your past. It's done. But there are things in our lives that God leaves there to make us stronger. I want you to just think about that for just a second before we move on. Okay. So we're going to wrap up going into, how many people do we have? Keely, can we go into groups, or do you want to stay together? Keely there?
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself.
That's okay.
Yeah, we've got quite a number of people on today. So I've got to split up into groups.
Okay. So if you don't want to go into a group, maybe just message Keely, let her know that you don't want to go into a group. But we thought we'd take about 10 minutes And I've got a few questions that I can copy and put into the chat box so that you'll remember what the questions are. And it's just basic 3 questions. We kind of already reviewed them and we paused at each one of them, but we'll talk about them in the group if you're comfortable, and then we'll come back and pray together to wrap it up. Quick review. These are the 2 verses. I'm the true vine, my Father is the gardener. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it, he cleared it of its stones, and he planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the middle of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it, and he looked for it to yield grapes. Okay, so here's the questions in our breakout groups if you're comfortable to discuss. 1, what does it mean for you to see God as the gardener in your life? And 2, where is your terroir and land? Where are you planted or being transplanted? And what are your rocks? What are the large ones that might need to be removed? And what are the small ones that might stay there to help strengthen and build resilience and help you grow? You're not going to have time to do all 3. So just whatever one feels good to you that you want to discuss in the group is fine. Okay. And then we'll come back in a couple minutes. I will try to post those, and I'll do that while Keely is breaking us into groups. Sound good? Okay. I'm going to close off in prayer and just wrap up. And if Keely or Theo, you have anything afterwards, I'll give you a chance and then we'll be done. Okay? Okay, let's pray. Thanks, God, that you are so relatable and you give us images and metaphors and symbolism that we actually can relate to and see you in. And thank you that you not only are relatable, but you want relationship with us. Thank you that you enjoy the process of just being with us and watching us grow and tending to us and helping us get rid of the rocks in our lives and yet keep the little stones that help us to be resilient and to grow stronger. Thanks that you know how to tend to each of us in individual ways because you are a God that knows how to speak to us in individual ways. And you've planted us in places that are deliberate and are planned for us. God, there's so much in there that we can think about and just go so deep and find treasures in. So Lord, I pray this week that as we go our ways, that we bring some of these thoughts with us, and maybe as we're walking along or as we're gardening ourselves, that you'd bring some of these things back to our mind and just help us to dig deeper into these treasures and to learn more about you and to grow deeper with you. We love you, Lord, and thank you for loving us first. We pray all this in your name. Amen.